Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session on the UNESCO's 1974 recommendation, which emphasizes the importance of education for peace, human rights, and international understanding. Well, let me first start by introducing the presenter and also panelists. We have Lydia Ruprecht, Team Leader for Global Citizenship, Section for Global Citizenship and Peace Education at UNESCO Paris. And for panelists, His Excellency Konkor Talha, Ambassador of Bangladesh to UNESCO, and he is also active member of the Group of Friends for Global Citizenship Education in UNESCO. And Madame Amasera Nelkweye Tete, Secretary General of Ghana National Commission for UNESCO. She is a leading voice of UNESCO in Africa. Just 2 months ago, under her leadership, the Ghana National Commission for UNESCO organized a meeting of national commissions, UNESCO national commissions in Africa. And Professor Dae-Hoon Jo at the Seongshin Women's University here in Seoul, Korea. He is the leading expert on global citizenship education in Korea. He is a professor of social studies education. And lastly, Lili Lapalainen, founder and chairperson of Bridge 47, which is a global coalition of NGOs dedicated to the attainment and advancement of SDG 4.7, especially global citizenship education. Well, we have this excellent combination of panelists, career diplomat, and also leading voice of UNESCO in Africa, and also leading expert in GCED, and we also very strong leader in civil society for GCED. We will first watch the video made by UNESCO on the history of the 1974 recommendation concerning education for peace, cooperation, international understanding, and human rights. Please enjoy the video.
The idea of establishing a standard-setting instrument on education for peace and international understanding goes back to the very origins of UNESCO. In fact, the idea goes back even further to the predecessor of UNESCO, the League of Nations International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation. This institute combated prejudices and stereotypes in history and geography textbooks, and actually issued an international declaration on the teaching of history in 1937. When UNESCO was born in the ashes of the Second World War, it was with the vision of helping to prevent that such devastating destructions and a denial of human dignity that had taken place during the war would ever happen again. UNESCO's mission was defined as building the defenses of peace in the minds of men. Education was essential in order to achieve this goal. This is why all through UNESCO's history there have been attempts to establish a standard-setting instrument on education for peace and international understanding.
I hope you enjoyed the video. As you saw in the video, the UNESCO Constitution says that since the war begins in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So from the very beginning of UNESCO, education for international understanding and peace was the very essence of UNESCO's mission and vision. So now we are in this session, we are dealing with the 1974 recommendation on education for peace and international understanding. So you can see how important this session is. Okay. Now I would like to invite the Lydia Ruprecht, team leader for global citizenship education at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, to give us some introduction on the current status of the revision of the 1974 recommendation. Lydia, are you there? Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here, connecting from Dublin, where there is another actual conversation going on here in the European context about global citizenship education. They're about to adopt a declaration. So the world is connected and in sync on global citizenship education, which is lovely. If you could please show the PowerPoint slide. Do you see? Yes, okay. And next slide, please. So what I would like to do now is to take a bit of time, and forgive me if it's a bit long, but I believe it's important maybe to explain what this recommendation truly is in a few words, and then to put you up to speed on where do we stand with the revision of this instrument. So the 1974 recommendation, it has quite a long title, but it is an ambitious instrument, is one of 8 UNESCO recommendations in the field of education, but it is actually the only one specifically devoted to education for peace and human rights among UNESCO's education instruments. Now, contrary to a convention, a recommendation is not ratified by countries, and therefore it is not considered a formally sort of a formally binding instrument. It's a non-binding instrument. However, because it is emanating from UNESCO's supreme governing body, which is the General Conference, it is intended to influence the development of national laws and practices. It also sets a standard, a norm, and it is recognized as a benchmark against which member states agree to be held accountable. Though not legally binding, it is also monitored by UNESCO's executive board every 4 years. UNESCO conducts what we call a consultation with all member states, inviting them to produce country reports on how they have implemented this instrument. And the information collected through this mechanism, so national reports, as many of you know, is actually the means by which we collect information on country level progress towards the achievement of Target 4.7, because Target 4.7 of SDG 4 in education is so aligned with the stipulations of the 1974 recommendation. Now, it is also not only a legal instrument, it's also an inspirational document. The 1974 recommendation is said to capture really the spirit of our organization, as Mr. Lim has just underlined, as it really inspires us to build peace in the minds of men and women. In that sense, it really is a landmark instrument because it brings for the very first time, not only the only time, but the first time, the connections between peace, international understanding, human rights, and fundamental freedoms together in one document. And it's a very bold instrument when you think that it was adopted in the 70s in the midst of the Cold War. It is also what we think is a very modern document in a way, because it offers an interdisciplinary approach to education, which is unique among UNESCO's member states. And in this sense, the guiding principles that are listed in the instrument have been used as a norm to develop policies and programs, and innovative in this sense, because it, for example, addressed issues around the role of technology in education. Already in the 70s, they were talking about television, but still opened the way to understand that learning and education would be deeply transformed by technological evolutions. It is also the first moment where we talk about the importance of integrating an international dimension in education. However, despite all this sort of strong components of the recommendation, it is true that the language and terms are clearly outdated in some places, and there are gaps. And the principles, though very valid, only cover partially the issues that we consider today as critical to address peace. And so for all these reasons, the international community decided at the last session of the General Conference that it was time to update the instrument to make sure that it reflects current challenges to peace and international understanding, and that it truly equips member states with an instrument that is cutting edge, relevant, and responsive to the needs of today. Now, the last component to describe the instrument is from the angle of what it brings to education, particularly. So it is, you can see if you have the chance to read it before the meeting, that the recommendation is really comprehensive. It covers all levels and types of education, formal and non-formal, even informal to a certain extent, and talks about preschool, post-secondary, technical vocational education training, adult education, and as they say, out-of-school children. It also provides a holistic perspective of education, and talks about social and emotional learning, though not in those terms, and talks about the whole individual and the need for education to be geared towards solving problems, not just the acquisition of knowledge, but towards action. Next slide, please. So we have here a very good base to start with. And so the revisions that were underway really built on the existing text in the spirit of trying to preserve and strengthen the instrument while updating it to make it more relevant to our current context. As you can see, I see that the instrument, as it is adopted, has several sections that cover the technical guidance. And so among the changes that needed to be done was to expand this list of technical guidance, because as you can see, the sections 4 onwards of the instrument are quite disjointed. They're spread over 7 chapters, and there are gaps, as I just mentioned. You will see that there's hardly no mention of curriculum. Assessment issues were not addressed. There's nothing about learning environments or school climate. And there's no mention of the role of school communities overall that are really so important today to transformative approaches to education. And of course, there's no discussion about the digital tools and as risks and opportunities, which is natural, but that was also one of the gaps. Next slide, please. So where do we stand with the revision process? So building on the text as it was, the idea was to align it with normative instruments adopted since 1974. So that includes normatively the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in the early 80s, which was an incredible step forward. The Convention on Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, the very important 2011 Declaration on Education for Human Rights, which was adopted OHCHR, et cetera, and of course the SDG framework, which really was a significant a moment for the international community. So aligning the instrument with the adopted language, and as well as to consider the outcomes of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which launched a massive consultation process, and it resulted in very interesting conclusions that have inspired the work of the revision. So the idea of the recommendation is really to operationalize, in a sense, these aspirations and the vision coming out of the International Commission, to make sure that the recommendation becomes a tool to reimagine our education systems going forward to address peace, and also as we emerge slowly and heal from the COVID pandemic. So UNESCO is responsible for the overall coordination and facilitation of the revision process. This revision process is guided by UNESCO's rules of procedures concerning recommendations to member states, that is, which are in line with UNESCO's a constitution and a resolution 17 that was adopted by our General Conference. So in short, the revision process is very much a regulated process that is taking place in 3 phases. There's the preparation phase, and then there was, importantly, the technical consultation phase. It started in March and ran until July. And during this period, we did our utmost to consult as wide as possible UN agencies, IGOs, regional and global, NGOs, teachers, young people, academics, professionals working in these areas, UNESCO national commissions as well. We conducted thematic consultations on certain topics, such, for example, monitoring or sustainability, consultation with teachers and youth. We did a lot of reviews of evidence, commissioned papers. All in all, 3,000 people from over 131 countries were consulted, and all the results of this can be found on our website. Now I'll give you the link to that in a minute. And all this rich resources that were collected and insights were then shared with an international expert group that was established by the Director General to advise the organization on how to actually draft and edit the revisions. So this IEG, the expert group, was composed of 22 experts from all regions and from a variety also of fields of expertise, including education, law, psychology, conflict resolution, sociology, teachers, teacher trainers, researchers, and youth activists. And this has resulted in a first draft that is now complete and was shared with all member states in September for their written comments by the 23rd of December. Next slide, please. So here you have the website reference to see where you can to find all the outcome reports of all the consultations. And I really encourage you to go through these pages. There's a lot of interesting materials there that will be used, I think, beyond recommendation. Next slide, please. So what has actually changed? There's, first of all, a change to the title. There was a concerted effort to shorten the title. What you see now is the proposed title, which is now Recommendation Concerning Education for Global Citizenship, Peace, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development. Now, this title singles out the ultimate goals of the recommendation, which are also in the original title, which is Peace and Human Rights. We added Sustainable Development because, as we know today in the 21st century, that there can be no peace without sustainable development, and all that includes, as underlined in the Agenda 2030. We also added global citizenship because this is the means today, just like international understanding was identified as a means in 1974 by which we can achieve these goals in our globalized world. Global citizenship can help create those bridges and bonds between people, societies, and the planet, and put societies and individuals on a path of transformation to achieve peace and human rights and sustainable development. So, shorter title. Next slide, please. There is also, as you can see here, the before and the after, a more streamlined structure. Inspired very much by other recommendations that were recently adopted, for example, on artificial intelligence. The idea was to make the structure more legible, grouping all the technical guidance into one chapter, section 5, which is action areas. We've also added 2 new sections, which is entirely new content. One is on follow-up and review, which talks about the monitoring and much stronger language, or stronger, more enriched language compared to the original, and a section on promotion, which encourages dissemination and outlines the possible areas of work for different stakeholder groups. And these sections were enhanced based on a lot of input received and shared by professionals working in the field, and I would like to thank those that are connected today who contributed to that. We also added an appendix which lists all the relevant global international norms that relate to the recommendation and which were adopted since 1974. And this is important because this instrument really builds on, as I indicated, adopted language. And we felt that this was important to have this consigned in the instrument. Next slide, please. Now, the other set of changes beside the title and the structure is that we've tried to update concepts and integrate new themes. So we updated the terminology and concepts to reflect current state of knowledge on child development and what we believe works in education today. So while doing so, we made sure to align it with the language of these international legal norms. Some of the updating involved changing the terms used, such as educator instead of teachers, to make sure that we were truly integrating formal, non-formal, and informal approaches to education. Languages around culture were significantly updated, and this is to reflect the important advancements that were done in the field of culture, with the whole series of UNESCO culture conventions adopted in the early 2000s, clarifying what is understood by cultural diversity, the preservation and safeguarding of culture, intangible heritage, etc. So this new and more precise terminology introduces greater nuance in a document around the role of culture and education and the intersection of the two, which was only superficially addressed in the original. Finally, language around human rights was strengthened in light of adopted language. In terms of new themes that were integrated, many new themes integrated to address contemporary challenges to peace and to harness the true transformative power of education. And then chief among these is the notion of sustainability, which is now mainstreamed throughout the document. As we know today that there can be no lasting peace without sustainability and a profound change in society and more rights and dignity, the instrument also integrates commitments that aim to sustain life within our planetary boundaries and integrating this paradigm in our approach to education, and therefore also addresses issues of climate change, education, and gender equality, etc. Now, inspired by the outcomes of the UNESCO International Commission on the Future of Education, the changes to the recommendation also invite countries to rethink education, how, where, and when, and for what purpose we education and we embark on learning in order to ensure it is truly transformative and emancipatory at the individual level, but also at a collective level. And so accordingly to that, the document also, we hope you will see, it contains a true participatory approach to education, and it expands the role of non-state actors, underlining the need that the content, the management approaches of education need to evolve in conversations with communities and stakeholders. And this goes from learners to teachers to populations and communities. And of course, the risks and opportunities of digital learning were expanded, building on also some recommendations and open educational resources, and that is also fully respected. So finally, next slide, please. Thank you. The recommendation enhances specific areas of a system of education, as you can see. To make sure that the recommendation gives a true system-wide approach, which is required to engage the education system into a transformation. And so you see how we've grouped these technical guidance into two blocks by level and by component of the educational system. So I won't go into further detail now, but hopefully this gives you a good sense of the depth and the breadth of the changes that were introduced to the document.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Just one last word is just to say that the next steps, and then I will conclude, is just to remind people where we stand, is that so indeed, as I said, the document has been shared, and we have until the 23rd of December for member states to submit their written comments, and then we will be doing a second draft of the document in the spring of 2023. In view of having it reviewed and discussed at an intergovernmental meeting, which will take place on the 30th of May to the 2nd of June at headquarters. And hopefully that process will lead to a document that is seen to be a consensus document to be submitted to UNESCO's General Conference in November 2023 for final adoption. So the document is now in member states' hands, and we do look forward to receive these comments until we'll continue in the process. And I will end here. Thank you, Mr. Lim.
Thank you very much for your excellent introduction. That helped us a lot clearly understand why we should revise this recommendation and also what is changed in the revised text. So now the floor is open for the audience for questions or comments. This is a very rare opportunity for us to ask questions or make comments to the very key person who is in charge of this revision process. So I hope you will take this opportunity and please ask questions or make comments in the chat box. I will ask your question. I read out your questions and Lydia will answer your questions or respond to your comments. Okay, one question is with regard to, one question is the feedback only from the governments or any possibility for civil society to make inputs? This is a question from the audience. Lydia, please.
Thank you. At this stage, the document is really in member states' hands. The process is with them, and they have the opportunity to provide written comments. However, we do encourage member states. So it's at the national level for them to consult widely as they prepare their inputs. In this sense, civil society is encouraged to reach out to their national commissions or to the national authorities who are line ministries working with UNESCO to see how they can contribute to the process. So it's in the hands of countries, but when we say countries, it also leaves room for consultation. It is up to each country.
Yeah, I think Lydia's answer is very clear. So now it is the draft is in the hands of member states, but member states does include civil society. So civil society is encouraged to participate in this process actively. Okay, I don't see any further questions, so I will close this section. And Lydia is a co-moderator of this session, so I now invite Lydia to take over the role of moderator. Thank you very much, Lydia. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this first part of the session. Thank you. So now that we've had this introduction on the recommendation, we'd like to maybe expand a little bit on the opportunities offered by this process and the document itself. So as I indicated, the objective of revising the instrument is to update and strengthen it, of course. But it's also a process, an instrument that can help to unite the international community and all stakeholders around a vision of the goal of education in our 21st century. And there are a variety of initiatives around the world that are already engaged in that. But any opportunity we have to strengthen, to unite efforts, of course, will take the agenda forward. So how can the revision of the recommendation truly help strengthen this unity of understanding around the goal of education? So my first question is addressed to His Excellency Konkor Mohammed Talha. Welcome. And as a member of the group of friends, I have a question. How can the revision of the 1974 recommendation, in your perspective, help advance global citizenship education in particular, which is at the heart of the SDG 4 and is really seen maybe as a key a vision of defining that ultimate goal of education? On to you.
Well, thank you very much. I think with this revision we have sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We are revising this document after 50 years. Although this discourse has been there for more than 100 years. And all we have is a set of recommendations. I think we need to work for a more robust document, which is more binding in nature. And you can only have binding documents when you have the participation, the full participation of the member states, which will create the ownership. Without the ownership, some countries may be implementing the recommendations while others may not. And there could be various reasons for not being able to implement those recommendations, and we need to also address those. And I would suggest that while we talk about the rights, we also need to talk about the responsibilities and how to ensure those rights. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, this issue of rights and responsibilities is true. That's a core principle of a human rights-based approach to issues, and that is a strength that a recommendation like this can help determine those rights and responsibilities. So now I'd like to turn to Riley. He's actually with me here, and I turn my head because he's not too far from me in the room here in Dublin. Really, now, to make sure the recommendation concretely supports peace, international understanding, and creates this consensus, because right, it's always important that these instruments unite the international community. It is important to build on synergies, and because we know that there are very interesting dynamics in every region of the world, in every country, in every pocket of society. So building on regional and global frameworks is important. So under the leadership of Bridge 47, the European Region and Civil Society developed in 2019 the Envision 4.7 roadmap in support of SDG Target 4.7, which is a strong document that supports GCED and education for sustainable development and other forms of transformative education. I'd like to hear from you, what connection do you see between the revised recommendation and this Envision roadmap and other European declarations, such as the one that's being discussed here in Dublin? On to you, really. Excuse me, 1 second, really. Do you hear? I can't hear you. Does anybody hear, really? No, you don't. Maybe your camera is on mute. No. Maybe would you like to come here? We'll improvise here. Apologize, sorry. If you don't mind,
it's fine. Yeah, sorry for that. It's technology doesn't really help us always. Sometimes it helps a lot, but really sorry. But thank you very much for the invitation, and really happy to be here with you. And like Lydia said, there are the other processes what we have done in the European level, and there's one going on at the moment, and that's why we are in Dublin together at the moment. But indeed, I think that I'm happy that exactly the revision is going to happen at the moment. At the same time, have a little bit fear that we don't really lose everything which is there, because the version is very good from our point of view at the moment. And I think that the key issue is really that how the member states are involved on the process and how they are involving the other actors. Because I also see that it's not only the product which is coming in the end, hopefully in a good format and good content, but it's also the process that, for example, what is happening in the national level, how exactly the key stakeholders can come together and have a dialogue together on that. And I think that's really important, because that's not only the ownership point of view, but it's also really having the dialogue so that exactly the implementation is happening together. Because unfortunately we have the kilos of the papers what we have agreed, and if we are not really implementing those, then I think that nothing is going to be happen. So that's perhaps some short first comment, and I'm happy to comment on the content afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, really, for that switcheroo. Thank you. Yeah, so this echoes what His Excellency mentioned about ownership at a country level, which is so important, because to take action, everybody needs to see how they can relate to the instrument and what can they concretely do. So the revised recommendation in that sense is important, must speak to and help address the needs of countries, their populations, and those that are engaged in the field of education or in educational work. Now, to what extent is the revised recommendation in line with national plans and priorities to advance peace? This is something I would like to ask right now and explore with our speaker from Korea, Professor Dae-hoon Jo. Are you with us?
Yes.
Hello and welcome. In the case of Korea, the 1974 recommendation in its original form has been a real game changer, as I understand it. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Korea was inspired by the 1974 recommendation to advance education for international understanding and cooperation, peace, and human rights over the years? Because it's also by looking back on how things have happened in the past, can we also do better or at least the same in the future? On to you.
Thank you for the question. I love your expression, game changer. More specifically speaking, the 1974 recommendation began to play an important role, especially since the late 1990s, when the influential 7th National Curriculum was implemented. And during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, some of you may know, the South Korea was ruled by authoritarian military leadership. And because of that political climate, the tenets of the 1974 recommendation, such as peace, justice, cultural diversity, international understanding and cooperation, were more like educational rhetoric. But in the late 1990s, as the democratization of the Korean society underwent, the South Korea jumped into the stream of the globalization in terms of the nation's politics, economy, and education. So the 1974 recommendation became a very important, useful compass in establishing educational policies and national curriculum in South Korea. It offered a very important set of education principles and contents for South Korea, which was actually very strongly constrained by the ethnic nationalism and Cold War ideology in those days. So, but I'd like to add one more thing. In those days, the contextualization of the 1974 recommendation was heavily influenced by the neoliberal perspective. So the 1974 recommendation was interpreted as contributing to the cultivation of globally competent citizens in the global market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's really very interesting, because we see how an instrument, in fact, can have a delayed impact. It's very interesting that there was a period of a gap period, a silence period, before it was actually used. So there's unsuspected consequences of such an instrument that can linger long after its actual adoption, right? And also how the meaning has evolved over time and in context. So that's very interesting. Thank you so much for that. So continuing on this notion of how the recommendation finds its place in national histories and narratives and development processes, I would like to turn to the other panelists and ask them how the recommendation can be used nationally and resonates with national context and priorities. And here I'd like to turn first to His Excellency Konkur Mahad Tala and tell us a little bit how he sees this speaking to the Bangladeshi context. And then I'll ask for our colleagues from Ghana to speak. Excellency.
Well, you see, I think every country has developed their own curriculum from their own experiences, and history plays a huge part in that. We have had a history of, we have a colonial history, and then we had history of oppression. We have a history of war of independence, and even before that, we were ruled by entities which were not indigenous. All these has had in Bangladesh created different types of education systems, and now it's I would say it's a very happy coincidence for us that when the 1974 recommendation is being reviewed, we are also in the process of revising our own curriculum, and what we are trying to do is to sort of unify the different types of educational systems that we had, and set a standard, and that standard would definitely, I mean, we can draw hugely from the 1974 recommendation and its revised version. And having said that, I should also add that whatever document we come up with in the next General Conference, that should be a live document, because, and that should have a periodic review mechanism as well, because we do not need to wait for another 50 years to revise these recommendations. And countries can actually draw inspirations from this. As you have rightly said, that this is an inspirational document, and countries can very well draw inspiration from this document to devise their own policies and pedagogies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And now turning to Ghana, Ms. Awa Sewa Nekitete. Please tell us more about what's happening in Ghana, and how do you see this instrument resonating in national context?
Thank you. And since I'm taking the floor for the first time, let me say congratulations to UNESCO for the process and how far you've come with it. I, for one, am really happy that the name will change. For far too long, it has only been the 1974 recommendation, because to try to name it any other way was difficult. I also agree with previous panelists when we say that it is inspirational, but it is also aspirational. Our constitution, the Ghanaian constitution, which was promulgated in 1992, speaks to the importance of being global citizens. And therefore, we've always had this at the back of everything that we do in the country. A bit like Bangladesh, we have in the past 2 years undertaken a review of our curriculum. Our local circumstances enjoin us to practice the tenets of the recommendation, because even within country, we are made up of various tribes, various languages, etc. And therefore, the tenet, even though it's global citizenship and sustainable education, it works really well in our local settings. We are changing part of our curriculum to let students right from early childhood, and we are very glad to see that that has shown up clearly in the draft recommendation. Begin to see that as important as their personalities and their individualities are, we are part of a wider group, and how to understand each other and work cooperatively with others. And so our curriculum has undergone that change to reflect the modern nuances. Like you said, after 50 years and with all that has happened in our world since then, And I am glad that this conference has been looking at digitization and how this has changed our world and brought us closer. With all of that, it is important to begin to train our children to ensure that they'll be global citizens, not only for when they happen to be out of their country, but because the rest of the world is coming to them, whether they like it or not. But you also said that it's in the hands of member states. And this is a recommendation after all, as strongly worded as it is. It is up to member states to ensure that their policies and laws follow these recommendations. And UNESCO's role as a standard setter is clear here. It is up to us as a national commission then to bring all stakeholders together to ensure that we are speaking to the different people. Someone asked earlier, if by government you only mean the ruling government. But then this is the niche of national commission. We have to ensure that all voices within the country are brought together so that we can add what UNESCO is doing. Later, this recommendation will become reflective. And finally, I agree that it should be a living document with a periodic review mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. And actually, this is something I'd like you to explore in a minute. I'm glad to hear that you agreed about the role, the powerful roles of convening power of the national commissions and what they can do to bring together civil society. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more how you see that happening in Ghana in a second. Before we get to that, I would just maybe like to ask a word from Really, because he has to leave us in a minute. Looking to the future and how we hope to see this instrument becoming an active tool, not just a collection of principles and ideals, but a real instrument for policy reform, design, and advocacy. I would like to ask Really, how do you see that being possible? How can it translate into action concretely, either in the Finnish context or through the work you're doing in the European level? Passing over to Really.
I would say that this concrete collaboration, what is happening here, practice. So thanks a lot, Lydia, for the question and this whole points. I really see that very fundamentally important tool for us, whoever we are. I'm representing civil society in many ways, but I think that it's really the key issue that how exactly we use that as some kind of global frame, what we can really use that both in the regions, but also in the national levels. Is it including for the school curriculum or the other activities, what the states can do? Because definitely the state has many big roles in many issues, including the school curriculum, but also enabling the environment for allowing different actors to participate and really make their contributions. And how we know about this situation, unfortunately, in the world, that this shrinking space for civil society is increasing. And it's really important one that frame can also help to really allowing different actors to express these feelings and having the dialogue and building the societies in a peaceful way. So that's very important one. But also we should think about the different kind of resources. And I'm not only talking about the government's budget, which is really important one, that there are the resources on that, but it's also understanding that we need to have the human capital, which is not only coming from the schools, but of course that is the basics, fundamentally important one. But there's an element of this learning where I think that we definitely need to really think about and learn together. And perhaps we need to have a little bit more holistic view. And I'm just taking the one example from Finland, where we as a civil society has contributed very well together with other actors. But we are now making this some kind of action plan for Finland by 2030. So we are in the midterm of the SDGs at the moment, and how to speed up so that exactly those areas where the Finland is not perfect yet, or we are nothing perfect in anywhere, but let's say that those areas where we have to really make the more progress. So we have established the system thinking, and that's why I really like as part of this document that is really thinking the systems, so that we have identified 6 different areas which we definitely need to really make the progress. And one of those is education, civilization, and the sustainable consumption habits. So thinking that a little bit in a larger perspective, taking the education and learning as a key element itself and progresses on that, but taking the learning and education as some kind of foundation for everything what we do. So I really think that definitely we can keep the good structures what we're having, but in parallel we definitely need to develop the new ones, because we need to find the solutions which are really making the change now. Unfortunately, the clock is ticking against on us, and we need to speed up definitely on that. But indeed, I'm really thankful for this opportunity to join you, and Bridge 47, which is the global network. We are more than happy to join and continue the work together with you. But thank you very much, and I'm really sorry I need to jump to the other opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, really, and for underlying this point that as we need to be ambitious, and this is the underlining idea here about the way we transform education to make sure that if we really achieve the goal of building peace, or at least contribute to societal efforts to build peace, because education alone can't do it, there is a need to rethink the governance, right? To create these means of bringing different stakeholders in civil society with formal education actors to make this a whole of education learning effort. So understanding the system in a real broad terms is important. And hopefully the recommendation can be a base to start a conversation on how this can be done. So thank you, really. Back to you, Amma. How do you see the instrument being used concretely by national commissions, or what national commissions can do to take it forward?
Well, it starts in our role in getting the final recommendation to UNESCO and being passed at the next General Assembly conference meeting. What that means is that we must lead a consultative process, because it brings together various facets of our society. Like I said earlier, national commissions are uniquely placed, and already in many African countries, I am aware that this process has started. Uganda just led the work on the Education for Sustainable Development Framework for the country, the Ugandan National Commission. And can I just say that for me, one of the good things about this recommendation is finally bringing ESD and global citizenship together. They are one side of the same coin, and we have to begin to look at it not as separate things, but as affecting each other. What we are going to do is to do the dissemination as well. Entities need to know that a review of the recommendation is taking place. We are aware that we have until the 22nd of December, 23rd, I think, to send inputs. And so there are various ways of disseminating the first draft and asking for inputs, or like we want to do in Ghana, host an online meeting of stakeholders, collect input and forward it to UNESCO for further review. So we see that leading the consultative process, disseminating the information on what is being done, and asking for feedback. That way, given the use of the internet, we are really able to really be a part of this review, and eventually be able to adopt and use a recommendation as something that we had an input in. That, I believe, is what the national commissions can do in this situation.
Thank you very much for that. And if I may make a suggestion, we would be happy to hear how UNESCO can be helpful also in the future. So as you consult, ask, what would be a role for UNESCO to be supporting effectively the implementation of the recommendation. I heard from really this issue of national action plans and finding their way into the national action plans. Of course, bridging ESD and GCED and other transformative approaches to education, but many different things are possible. But knowing what is most useful would be helpful. So,
and
so
I thank you for that. Before you move on, I'd like to say I thank you for that. And it's a good opportunity for me to say that APSU has also been supportive in helping us integrate GCED into our curriculum. I'd like to acknowledge them.
Yes, thank you for doing so. Thank you. We are very proud and happy to be working with EPSEO continuously. Thank you. Now I'd like to ask Professor Dehujo, is there a specific role from where you're sitting and seeing things for higher education institutions as often teacher training institutions as well? That is also one of the functions of higher education, but not just that. Please tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm teaching at the College of Education. Thinking of the lifelong learning aspect of global citizenship education, I think universities and colleges should be a critical part of the promotion of GCED. But from my viewpoint, until recently, in many countries, including South Korea, the promotion of GCED or the mainstreaming of GCED was not the main issue for the higher education. And the monitoring was not the issue either. So I suggest there should be two important tasks for the higher education. The first task should be about for the general education of universities. And the second important task should be for the pre-service teacher education system. And I'd like to share the case of South Korea. Since 2015, the government has increasingly paid attention to the sector of higher education. And they launched several relevant projects for the higher education. And one of the exemplary initiative from my perspective is so-called the National Project on the Capacity Building of Citizenship Education for Pre-Service Teachers. It's a long name. Or we can call it CVCE in short. And we are in the first phase of this project. This is a 4-year project, and the government selected a number of universities and supported their innovation in the area of curriculum and instruction. So those universities are currently making some changes in their actual major curriculum, extracurricular programs, or especially for the college education, they restructure this program for the internship. So the ultimate goal of this project is totally dedicated to the promotion of pre-service teachers' capacities for the citizenship education. And the second task is for the general education of the universities. And I'd like to mention the APSEU's recent project on the development of the GCED courses. And I remember that this started since the 2016 or 15. And the APSEU selected a number of universities' GCED courses whose main goals is to promote the theme of GCED in various areas. And the APSEU consolidated the outcomes of those course development and implementation, and they publicize the major findings from the project every year. And finally, but not the least, I think the monitoring project should include the higher education. But currently, the monitoring framework is only for the compulsory education. But except for the higher education. So I think my third suggestion is to include higher education, university and colleges, include those university and colleges into the current monitoring project in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, and I've taken good note. I hope that they will. These are suggestions that will all find their way in the Korean comments to UNESCO on the instrument. So this concludes, I think, the round of questions I had for the panelists. We could continue, but maybe I'd like to just pause right now because there's always so much has been said, and open the floor to questions. And here I would just have to ask my colleagues to help with that.
Yeah, Lydia, there is one question to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Are there any elements in the current draft that are particularly contentious? I cannot see anything problematic and wonder about the length of the process, therefore.
Interesting. Contentious issues, that's a difficult one. I mean, anyone's contentious. That's a trick question to say contentious. Well, at least for UNESCO, we feel that what is there is truly in line with best practices, with the state of knowledge of research and education, and what we know actually is effective to change behaviors, to prepare people to face contemporary challenges and engage in constructive dialogue under duress and stress and conflict. So it seems to be going in the right direction. Now, contentious, it depends on each country context, and I wouldn't want to preempt what is contentious to some and contentious to not to others. So I don't know if I can answer that question. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Okay, probably our ambassador could help us here because he is a diplomat.
Well, that for a diplomat is a very difficult question to answer as well, because sometimes we have to argue against what would apparently be a very rational argument, and then we'll have to have some counter arguments to that. But I think education is such an universally accepted issue, and so is the concept of peace, that we would expect that there would not be many contentious issues. But when it comes to the rights and responsibilities, how you look at those rights and responsibilities could be a matter of contention. How do you attach the responsibilities to various actors? And then usually the funding issue becomes contentious. So again, what we read as a completely innocuous document may turn out to be a very heatedly debated one while we sit inside the committee. I know it doesn't help much, but that's how it happens.
True. And if I just may add on the process, I think it's important to understand that a recommendation is not a research paper, which is only developed on the basis of fact and analysis. It has to be the point of agreement among countries. So it is by definition required that it evolve and it reflect the views of all. Right? That is what participation is about. So I don't know if contentious is the right word, but there are different views on some of these topics. But there must be points of agreement. And that is why we hope to see that there be a constructive atmosphere and disposition among member states because of the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing today, be it climate change, the spread of hateful ideologies and speech online, and that trickles into reality, that we must come together and make sure that our education systems contribute to building solutions in constructive ways, because we all have an interest in peace, right? So, but obviously the solutions can differ from country to country. So, but there is common ground. So, contentious issues may just mean debates and constructive debates to find the points of consensus and agreement. But that is something to look forward to and to embrace, rather than to be worried about.
Well,
That's on my end. Is there any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
yeah,
Muslim.
thank you for that answer. We have another question from the audience. With regard to the non-binding nature of the 1974 recommendation, how do you propose more countries adopt the principles of the recommendation? What are the roles of UNESCO and other related stakeholders such as APSEU in extending the mandates of the 1974 recommendation? So, question is about the how do we encourage more countries to adopt and implement the principles of the recommendation? What is the role of UNESCO?
Well, I was going to ask my panelist friends here to offer a response. So I'll just be brief, and maybe have others pitch in and see how they see things. But there's pros and cons with non-binding instruments. The fact that it's a non-binding instrument means that it's also it invites to consensus, right? Because it is more open and inclusive, because it doesn't have that binding character, which leaves room for non-state actors as well, right? Probably more so. So there's opportunities here in the fact that it's a non-binding instrument, but what the strength of it is that it is nonetheless a legal normative instrument with mechanisms. So its built-in mechanisms are what are the means by which we can try to enlarge the group of stakeholders that participate in ensuring the implementation of the recommendation. And for UNESCO, definitely as the custodian of the instrument, we are overseeing and ensuring the periodic review, for one, and then in the context of monitoring of the global target 4.7, UNESCO has a role there as well, to see how we can continue to use the 1974 recommendation as a means to monitor the target, adapting the guidelines for reporting to ensure that there is some sort of continuity in the data that's being collected. And so we will certainly be consulting to the views of different professional groups to see how that can be done in the future. So there are some answers. Would anybody else like to respond to that?
I would like to say something, please.
Please.
I believe that the shift towards recommendations rather than conventions also points to the fact that countries should be seen to want to do these things and not to have been bound to it. Despite the fact that these are recommendations, we all know that it's a guide. It is information available to guide you should you want to do this. The process it is going through, despite it being a recommendation, is a very consultative, open one. There is an opportunity for every country to make the changes as they see fit. Eventually have a document that belongs to all of us. And that is why I think it being a recommendation should not detract from its final achievements. Thank you.
Thank you, Amma. Would somebody else like to
I'd like to
react?
add one more thing.
Please do.
Regarding the non-binding nature of the 1974 recommendation, I think it is important to make the non-binding binding. I'm talking about the legalization of the citizenship education. In South Korea, the bill still pending at the National Assembly. The bill tentatively called the promotion of democratic citizenship education, but it's still, it's a long way to go. It's a daunting task, but if we make the bill effective, then I think the legalization is very promising. So I think the UNESCO or the world can support the legalization of citizenship education in individual countries. There is one way of making the non-binding nature binding.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's quite interesting in the sense that without making the actual instrument a legally binding instrument, the recommendation opens the way for creating law at a national level, but through the initiative of the assemblies, right? So it's not actually the instrument that's binding, but the how it's being then picked up nationally. So that's an interesting process in Korea. It would be interesting to see to what extent legalizing or making law is overall generally what are the pros and cons of that, and what as a strategy. Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. If there's no other comments on this point, maybe we can take another question, or we will just mindful of time.
Yeah,
We could also
we have
conclude. So if
comments from the audience. I find that countries like Pakistan need more efforts in the establishment of co-curricular activities as mainstream areas of education. Sports, theater, and debates are considered as extra and not as practical areas of participation. So I understand these comments is about the necessity of, or the need for making making this recommendation, making the transformative education contained, set out in the recommendation as mainstream areas of education. That's the comment.
I don't know if anybody would like to take it first, or I could say a few words. That is a big discussion about to what extent and how is the most effective way of embedding the stipulations of the recommendation into the curriculum. The idea is certainly to embed it in traditional topics, history, math, geography, science, physics, are the obvious, or citizenship or civics and citizenship education. Having standalone subjects is not seen as the most productive way, unless it's connected to specific class projects where learners have the opportunity to actually implement, to do something, to learn by doing with their schools and classes, taking the learning out of schools into the community and interacting with the community actors. That's critical. So that is a good point, but it's true that what we see now is in our current age, and with COVID, of course, things were amplified, is that learning is taking place in many different spaces, online and offline. Not all are certified, of course, lead towards diplomas and are evaluated, but learning is a fluid process at all ages and various spaces, and sometimes the least suspected areas, and where there's learning, professional associations in the workplace, etc. And there's a need to acknowledge that learning and to bring it in line with the having it contribute to the visions of the 1974 recommendation. And this is a bit what the ambition of the instrument is, that we've tried to mention that this learning is taking place in every pockets of society, and we hope that through the recommendation is adopted, there is this understanding that non-state actors that are delivering education, even if they're not folded into formal structures in the curricula. They remain co-curricular or extracurricular activities, but they are work towards the same goals. That is fundamental, right? That would be just my answer to that comment. If anybody else would react.
Well, I think GCED is not something that we can teach at school as a subject. It has to be practiced, and practiced from the very early stage of life. So, so primary, you start with pre-primary education. We need to practice this through government policies. We need to practice this, in fact, in every walk of life, wherever we go. We need to have those values reflected in the work of in the workplace, in our businesses, in our day-to-day work, in government's work, in the civil society work, and that's how we would be able to instill those values into the people. And that's how perhaps we'll only be able to achieve peace through GCED. And but then, of course, there has to be some sort of formal education, formal imparting of knowledge, best practices within some sort of institutional framework, and that institution perhaps is best. The best institution would be the primary schools and well, up to this, perhaps up to the secondary level. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's very true. When we were working on the recommendations, some of the experts were talking about the importance of educating communities and parents, and so the adult education was fundamental in this sense. How do you get adults that are already in the works life and that are taking decisions, that are voting, that are leading organizations, associations, that are being role models in their families and communities? How do we reach out to these people who may not have a generation that we're used to learning throughout life using online tools? How do we get them on the learning curve, right? Learning about new forms of citizenship online and offline. That's a major challenge. There are some possible recommendations in their instrument that address this point, but this is something that is probably going to be one of the most important areas of work going forward in the future, because our world is changing very fast. So lifelong learning is going to have to become a real priority in terms of social cohesion, so that every generation is also on the same page. Otherwise, we will see terrible gaps between generations as knowledge evolves quickly, and our capacity to master digital tools also evolve very quickly within generation. So, adult education, lifelong learning is something that is becoming very strategic going forward. So, unfortunately, I can't see the questions here on my screen. Are there any more questions?
There's no more question or comments.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we can proceed.
Okay, well then, in that case, then I'll just like to end here and then pass it on to you, and just to thank everybody for this very useful and interesting exchange. I've jotted down many interesting ideas for the next phase, because though we are still in the development of the revision, we are a couple steps ahead as well, thinking about the follow-up. What will be the strategy to ensure that there is follow-up and a broad participation of all concerned stakeholders in the implementation, but also the monitoring and the review of the implementation process. So thank you for that. Thank you all for your engagement. And to be continued, as we say, and hopefully stay posted on our website to see the next iteration of the document in the spring 2003.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lydia, for guiding the discussion so wisely and also for your concluding remarks. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts and views on the revision of the 1974 recommendation. And I thank also all the participants joining us online for this session. Well, I want to pick up one phrase. The Secretary General Amaserwa, if you allow me to use your phrase, the recommendation is not only inspirational but also aspirational. I think this phrase captures the essence, the core value of the recommendation very well. So, if you allow me, I want to use this phrase in the future very often. Thank you. Thank you. I think the conversation in this session reminds that the 1974 recommendation was adopted in the height of the Cold War. The arms race was going on, and the confrontation between the two camps was very serious, and the whole world was concerned about this crisis. So there was this sense of crisis shared by all the nations at that time. And this shared sense of crisis made the adoption of the recommendation possible, despite all the different views, different ideologies, and different interests. But again, in today's world, I think we can agree that we are now seeing again this very serious crisis. As you know very well, the war is going on in Ukraine, and we don't see any sign of ending. So this is very dangerous, and also the strategic competition between the most powerful countries in the world is intensifying, and tensions are going up everywhere. As you know, the North Korean missiles were fired, and so I think this situation today is also making us take steps to to revise or update this important recommendation, so that we can have a fresh impetus, fresh momentum to implement this important recommendation, and all the guiding principles and all the values contained in the recommendation. So I think today's session was very important, and we have touched upon the crucial issues. And as you said, we need to continue our discussion until we finally adopt the revised recommendation November next year. But that's not the end. There will be another starting point. We should we should revitalize our will and our energy and our efforts to implement all those principles and all those values contained in the recommendation. So with that, I conclude this session. Thank you again, all the panelists, and also the co-moderator of this session, and also all the participants joining this session. for your participation and contribution. Thank you so much, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.